Hello, hope you're having a great week. I'm Rob from HomeStudioCenter.com, and today I want to talk to you all about a technique that I've been using for a while now called backwards mixing. And this is a really great way to mix with more efficiency and more speed, but also to get better mixes in less time with less plugins. And finally, it's also a really great way to have a system about your mixing, because it's really important to have some kind of system. You don't want to just move around the mix randomly, adjusting things here and there. You need to have a system. This is my system, it works for me. And if you're used to this kind of standard system of starting with a kick drum and then bringing in the bass and working from the foundation up, I think this is going to be a really interesting new way of thinking for you. And you might even mix like this already. So I'm going to give you some techniques for sticking to this ideology after I explain it, and then you can try it in your mixes. So this is actually the 7th part of an 8-part series all about EQ called the 1 month EQ challenge. And my challenge to you is to drastically improve one of your mixes in just 28 days. You get access to 8 free tutorials, videos and articles, as well as some really cool bonuses. You can click on the link in the video now or in the description, or go to 1 month EQ challenge to sign up for all of that. It's completely free. And so far we've covered things like the fundamentals of EQ and the 4 key approaches, muddy mixes, thin mixes, range allocation, and even the relationship between EQ and compression. So you can go get all of that for free. But now I want to talk to you about this technique of backwards mixing. So I call it backwards mixing because in your DAW, in your mixer, generally people have it set up in a way that you have all your individual channels on your left, and then after that you have like your group channels, which is simply the act of sending all of the instruments of a certain group to an aux channel, a stereo aux. So for example, I've got all the drums going to a channel here, all the kicks, because I've actually got 2 kicks, it's an acoustic kick and another sample, all bass because I've got 2 bass parts, verse guitars, chorus guitars, keys, backing vocals, lead vocals. So everything's going to an individual group. And this is really important. I'm going to talk more about that in a second. But then generally after that you might have effects, and then finally on the far right you've got your master fader, or I like to use a submix, so I can do all my processing on my entire mix without affecting the reference. So I've got the reference on a separate channel. And like I mentioned earlier on in this series, referencing is really important when it comes to EQ. It gives you a comparison, a basis for comparison when you compare your mix to a professional mix. And of course, you don't want all your processing to be on the reference. So I have that on a separate channel, and then they both go to the master fader. So I recommend setting it up like that. If you go sign up to the challenge, you'll get access to DAW templates that already have everything set up like this. Templates for Pro Tools, Cubase, Studio One, and Logic Pro. If not, you can just, if you use a different DAW, you can set this up yourself. But backwards mixing is the act of working backwards through your mixer. So from right to left instead of left to right. So instead of starting with your kick drum or your vocal and working slowly, bringing in instruments one by one, and then doing group processing, and then maybe some processing on your mix bus, instead I suggest doing the opposite and starting with your mix bus, then move into your group channels, and then adding processing to your individual channels at the very end. So this relates to my overall philosophy of mixing, which is start with the bigger picture and then slowly start to focus on the finer details. So you start with big things like balancing and then backwards mixing, and you end with things like automation, effects and spot effects, really small details within the mix. Because if you start with the small details, you're going to change your mind later in the mix. You need to make those decisions with the context of the mix, and you need to really start to get the mix together at an early stage with balancing and bus EQ and bus compression, because that will help with your confidence. It helps you to mix fast, it helps you to stay excited. And I call this overall process of starting with a bigger picture and then focusing on the finer details at the end, slow focus mixing, because you're slowly focusing on the details as you progress through the mix. So now let's actually talk about backwards mixing and how you implement that and the actual steps involved as it comes to EQ. Now you'll see I've actually got quite a lot of processing on my mix bus, and I'm not going to talk about a compression here, but I've got a lot of EQ going on. And there's a few reasons why I think applying EQ on your mix bus first is beneficial. First of all, it helps with confidence. You can get a good sound straight away. After you've balanced the mix and you've got a good static mix, you can compare your mix to your reference, and straight away you'll hear if it needs more brightness, if it needs more low end, if it's sounding muddy in the lower mids, if it needs more aggression, and you can make those EQ changes on the master bus, and straight away your mix is going to sound better. You're taking a big step towards your end goal, and that's going to really increase your confidence, keep you excited. But there's other benefits. Benefit number 2 is that by starting with EQ on your mix bus, you're mixing into it. You're considering that with every move. So if you dial in more top end on the mix bus, that means you don't need to dial in as much top end on a vocal or an acoustic guitar, for example, or a piano. Whereas if you did it the other way around and you mixed the individual channels first and then at the end you added a top end boost on your mix bus, it's going to completely throw off your entire mix. So it's best to start with those moves and then mix into them, because then you're going to be considering that at every stage and working with that EQ. And then the other 2 benefits, number 3, I've already mentioned, that confidence boost, and number 4, it helps you to mix faster and with less plugins. And time is always of the essence when it comes to mixing. The longer you spend on the mix, the less objective you become. Ear fatigue sets in and you're going to start doubting your decision. So 4 really important benefits there. So how do we actually implement this? Well, step 1, as I mentioned, is to compare your mix to your reference once you have a static mix. So let's bypass all of this for now. And let's compare this to my reference. So let's listen to our track first. Tell me, is this too much to handle? Conversation. And now let's listen to one of my references. I've actually got a few references going on here, but this is the reference that I used for kind of the low end and the vocal. I could bet all of the riches that I ever had. Now I'm going to flick between the 2 and just listen out for the differences. I could bet all of the riches. Tell me, is this too much to handle? I could bet all of the riches that I ever. Tell me, is this too much to handle? I could bet all of the riches that. So straight away there's some clear differences. I don't know if you heard that, but compared to the reference, I think my mix, it needs a lot more top end. It needs a lot more brightness and air to give it that modern sound. It's too bassy. There's too much going on in the low end and it's sounding muffled. It sounds a bit muddy as well. There's not much definition to the vocals and the other parts. Definitely the low end needs a lot more control. And also I think it needs more aggression in the upper mids. It sounds kind of dull, and it is quite a slow song. It's quite a relaxed, chilled out song, but I still want it to sound emotional and have some aggression to it. So step number 1 there you just saw was have an intention, compare it to your reference, think about what you want to achieve, because then you can reach for an EQ and you already know what you're trying to do. So I know that I need to probably reduce the low end, or control it with multiband compression. I need to remove some of that mud by cutting in that 200 to 400 frequency range, which we discussed in an earlier video as part of this series. I need to probably boost the upper mids a bit to give it a bit more aggression. It could be anywhere between maybe 4 and 7K. And I want to boost the top end and add some more air. So that's going to be that shimmer, like 10, 12 kilohertz plus. So I know what I want to do already. So first of all, let's bring in these plugins. And let's have a look at how I actually achieved those goals. So first of all, I'm using Revival, which is a free Slate Digital plugin. And this shimmer knob just adds some really nice top end. You can't see what's going on in the background, but it just sounds really silky. It adds like really nice top end without getting too harsh or aggressive or brittle. So I'm dialing in some shimmer. I'm also adding a bit of thickness, which just counteracts that top end boost as well. So we're boosting the lows a bit as well, but you'll see later on that I compensate for that. So we've also got a boost here at 5.4 kilohertz. And to find that, I would have just dialed in a boost and just moved this around until I found the sweet spot. I'm not doing boost and sweep. I'm just maybe boosting by 4 dB, moving around till I find a nice spot and then reducing it to 2.7, which is quite a lot for a mix bus EQ. Generally, I recommend keeping it to 1 or 2 dBs on your mix bus, maybe 3 if you know what you're doing, or if you're really sure it helps. So that's to dial in the aggression. And I've then got a cut. It was around 2 dB as well at 317. So that's removing the mud. I've also got a low shelf cut of quite a lot, 6 dB. That's pretty aggressive on everything below 134. And that's because there's a lot of low-end elements going on here in terms of arrangement. I've got a bass guitar in the chorus. I've got a bass guitar, a sub bass part. I've got a kick. I've got a kick sample with a sub bass. I've got this crazy sub reverb effect going on the kick as well, which I spoke about in an earlier video. So there's a lot going on. So I had to reduce that quite a lot. And then I've got some compression, just subtle.
Tell me, is this too much to handle?
So it's just catching the peaks. I've got another compressor here, which is a bit more constant, 1 or 2 dB, and that just really kind of improves the tone of the track, gives it a bit more glue between the instruments and the parts, helps to make it sound a bit more consistent, and actually a bit more aggressive as well, because I'm using a slower attack time. So mixed bus compression is important too. And then we got onto a few more EQs here. So this is actually a Pultec style EQ, and it may look complicated if you haven't seen one of these before. I'm going to break this down for you. So instead of a normal EQ where you just move it up or down, with this we've got 2 knobs, one to boost and one to attenuate or cut. So it's got this weird thing where you can boost and cut at the same time. But I'm not using it in that way. I'm literally attenuating, which is cutting 100 Hertz. So again, just removing some of that low end even more. I've then got a slight boost, only a very slight boost at 16 kilohertz, just to add in a bit more top end air. And then I've got another Pultec style EQ. This time, this is focusing on the mid range. So I'm not doing anything here. I've got a dip at 700. So that's just, again, just a frequency range that I heard was causing problems. It's not so much mud. It's more mid range. It's not lower mids. But just a slight dip there made a bit more room for those upper mids to shine through and become a bit more aggressive. And I've also got a boost at 3 kilohertz just to dial in a bit more of that aggression. And then I've got another boost at 3 kilohertz just to bring out those upper mids a bit more. And finally, I've got a boost at 20 just to bring up the sub. 20, of course, is very, very low. So even though I'm boosting 20, it's going to have an impact on 30 to 60, and you're going to hear that. And that's it for that EQ. So I've got 3 EQ plugins, but there's only a few moves going on, all working towards that end goal of reducing the mud, controlling the low end, dialing a bit more aggression in the upper mids, and increasing that top end shimmer. And then I do have a couple of multiband compressors just to control the low end a bit more and dial in a bit more energy, and finally a limiter just to bring the volume up. So that's all the processing. Let's listen without any of that EQ.
Tell me, is this too much to handle?
Now let's bring that all back in.
Tell me, is this too much to handle?
So you can hear big difference. A lot of the sound of the mix is coming from the mix bus processing. Let's compare it to the reference now.
Tell me, is this too much to
I could bet all of the riches that I have.
Tell me, is this too much to
So I'm happy with that. It's a step closer to that. It sounds more modern. It's got more of that aggression and top end. But it's still got quite a lot of warmth to it. Even though I've cut the low end and the low mids quite a lot, it's still got an element of warmth, which I wanted to retain because it is quite a chilled out song. So I'm happy with that. So then once you've done your mix bus processing, you can move on to your group buses. And again, this saves a lot of time and energy rather than going through and processing each keyboard part individually, because I've got quite a lot. All of these parts here are keyboard parts. So I don't want to add individual processing. You can see I've only got some gain staging and a bit of compression on this one. All of my processing is happening on the group channel. So EQ, massive top end boost because they're samples, and just boosting the top end of a MIDI based instrument is a really good way to make them sound a bit more lifelike and give them a bit more energy and air. And then various other boosts going on. You can see a lot of my processing is going on the group channels. BVs, processing them all at once. Verse guitars, all my processing's there. Bass guitar even, I've got 2 bass guitars. And then even on the whole drum kit, I've got some saturation going on. So loads of processing on the group buses. And this again helps you save time, because when you compare this to my individual channels, you'll see most of them don't have anything. Some of them have some gain staging, a lot of them don't. I've got some compression here and there. There's some channels though that you will have to do individual processing, specific processing on the channel. So bass guitar, for example. Of course, I've got a lot of processing on that. because I wanted to shape the tone there, and we've only got one bass channel, it's direct. If I was mixing a direct bass with an amp recording, I'd probably do the processing on a group bus, but because it's only a DI, I'm doing it there. Vocals as well, another example of a channel where a lot of the processing is going to be on the channel itself. And of course effect channels, I don't have an effect bus, I just have individual processing on the effects, because it depends what you're trying to do with that effect. You can see here vocals as well, and another vocal effect. So move from right to left, start with your mix bus, that's where a lot of the magic happens. Then do your processing on your group buses, that will save you lots of time, and it helps to keep things simple. Like we spoke about in a previous video about range allocation, if you're doing that with only, what have I got here, 8 channels, it's much easier to think about where you're boosting and where you're cutting with your EQ than if you did processing on, this must be 20-30 channels. So it's just much easier, much more efficient, and then finally any individual processing that can't be done on a group channel. So that's it for backwards mixing. It's part of my much larger philosophy of slow focus mixing, which I'm going to talk to you about very soon. Again, if you're not part of the 1 month EQ challenge, we've got one more part to come, which is going to be all about ear training and how that you can improve your hearing so that EQ becomes so easy and you can just pinpoint frequency straight away. And this is an important step. You don't want to become reliant on EQ charts, stuff like that. If you train your ears, it doesn't take a lot of time. It's not difficult. I've got a really simple way of doing it. That's going to make a huge difference in your mixes. So sign up for the challenge if you want to get access to all the previous videos and those bonuses, which were DAW templates, so you can set up your mix like this, a private video on EQ and vocals, a copy of my EQ ebook, and a chance to win a free mix critique from myself as well, and a total of 8 tutorials. The link in the video, or go to the link in the description, or go to 1montheqchallenge.com and you can sign up. It's all completely free. And don't forget to subscribe on YouTube, like this video if you found it helpful, leave a comment if you have any questions or if there's anything that you want to say, and I'll get back to you as soon as possible, and can't wait to see you in the next video. Have a great week.